Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today, I want to talk about leadership, but not in the narrow way people usually imagine it. When most of us hear the word leadership, we often think of a person with authority. We think of a boss, a manager, a team captain, or someone officially in charge. We imagine leadership as a title. But one of the most important things I've learned in OL 202 is that leadership is a much broader concept than that. Leadership is not limited to formal positions. It is not just telling people what to do. And it is definitely not something that only happens once you get a big job title. Leadership is a process. It happens in everyday situations, it happens in how you communicate, it happens in how you make decisions. It happens in how you influence people and how you respond to challenges and how you act when nobody is watching. That matters a lot for students going into digital media and journalism. In this field, you may not always think of yourself as a leader right away. You may imagine your future career as writing stories, creating content, interviewing people, designing media, managing platforms, or communicating information. But in reality, all of these things involve leadership. The stories you choose to tell matter. The way you frame information matters. The people you listen to matters. The value behind your work matters. And the way your audience experiences your content matters. So, in this lecture, I'm going to walk you through the five concepts from OL 202 that stood out to me most and that I believe will shape the way I approach my future in digital media and journalism. These five concepts are values and ethical action, communication and listening, credibility and persuasion, creativity and idea generation, influence and power. I chose these five concepts because they connect directly to the kind of work media professionals do every day. These are not random ideas, they build on one another. Ethical values shape communication. Communication shapes credibility. Credibility affects persuasion. Creativity helps us respond to new challenges, and all of that connects to influence and power. So, by the end of this lecture, I do not just want you to understand these concepts in theory, I want you to think about how they apply to your own future, especially if you are entering a field where communication, representation, and public impact matter. Because one of the biggest lessons of OL 202 is that leadership is not something you wait to grow into later. Leadership starts now, in the choices you make and in the kind of person you become. Before I go any further, I want to be clear about who this lecture is for. This lecture is designed for first year university students who are interested in digital media and journalism. I chose this audience very intentionally. I chose first year students because this is often the stage where people are still trying to figure out who they are, how university works, how team works, and what their future careers might look like. At this stage, leadership can feel far away. You may think leadership is something that matters later, once you are older, more experienced, or in a formal workplace. But OL 202 challenges these ideas. This course shows that leadership begins much earlier than that. It begins in how you design yourself, it begins in how you build relationships, it begins in how you make choices and how you respond to setbacks and how you treat other people. That is especially important in digital media and journalism because this field is built around people. You are constantly working with audiences, sources, editors, classmates, collaborators, and communities. You are dealing with interpretation, trust, representation, and responsibility. So, my goal today is to explain these five concepts in a way that feels practical, relevant, and clear for students who are still building their understanding of leadership. I want this to feel less like an abstract lecture and more like a guide for thinking about what kind of media professionals you want to become, a guide for thinking about how leadership already shows up in your studies and your everyday life and a guide for understanding why these concepts matter before you ever step into a full time career. Here is how today's lecture is going to work. We will move through five major concepts. First, values and ethical action. This is where leadership starts because values shape how we decide what is right, what matters, and what kind of impact we want to have. Second, communication and listening. Leadership is relational, and communication is one of the main ways leadership is experienced. Third, credibility and persuasion. This section explores why people trust certain voices, why trust can be gained or lost, and how persuasion works when communication carries influence. Fourth, creativity and idea generation. This is about leadership as problem solving, adaptation, and innovation. Finally, influence and power. This concept brings the others together because leadership is, at its core, about influencing others towards a common vision. So, as I go through each concept, I will do four things. I will explain the concept itself. I will connect it to the textbook ideas from OL 202. I will show why it matters in digital media and journalism. And I will explain how it will inform my own choices in my future career. That last part is important because the assignment is not just asking us to define leadership concepts, it is asking us to explain these ideas and how they will shape our future occupation. So, throughout the lecture, I will keep returning to that question: how will this concept shape the choices I make as a future media professional? That question turns this lecture from a course summary into something much more personal and practical. So, with that, I want to begin with the first concept, which I believe is the foundation for all the others, and that is values and ethical action. Of all the concepts in OL 202, values and ethical action stood out to me as one of the most important because it gets to the heart of what leadership really is. Chapter 5 of the textbook makes this very clear. It explains that at the heart of effective leadership is a strong sense of self and the values that guide a leader's work. It also emphasizes that alignment between expressed values and actions is essential. Because when leaders align their values with their behavior, they build trust and credibility with others. In other words, ethics is not separate from leadership, it is built into it. That point matters to me because in media and journalism, people are constantly making choices that affect others. What story gets covered, whose voice is included, what headline is chosen, what image is used, what information is emphasized, and what information is left out. These are not neutral decisions, they reflect values. The textbook also explains that ethics is concerned with right and wrong behavior, and that ethical decision making is not just only about what decision is made, but also how that decision is made and to what end. That means leadership is not just about getting results, it is about asking whether the process and the outcomes are ethically sound. For a future career in digital media and journalism, this is huge because media professionals can influence how audiences understand people, events, and social issues. So, if I want to work in this field responsibly, I can not only ask, can I make this content successful? I also need to ask, is it fair? Is it accurate? Is it responsible? Who it might harm? What assumptions am I making? And what values are shaping the choices I am making? One thing I really liked from chapter 5 is that it does not treat ethics as some distant abstract idea. It breaks ethics down into practical pieces, including moral principles, personal values, virtues, and ethical decision making. The textbook explains that personal values are what you find essential or worthwhile, and that even when you do not fully name them, values drive behavior. In many cases, your values become visible through your actions. This is a powerful idea. A lot of people talk about values as if they are private beliefs, but the textbook pushes us to see values as something visible. They show up in what we choose to do, they show up in what we ignore, they show up in what we prioritize. So, if a journalist says they value fairness, that should show up in how they represent different perspectives. If a content creator says they value honesty, that should show up in how they verify information. If a media professional says they value respect, that should show up in how they portray vulnerable communities. The textbook also explains that moral principles are broader truths about behaviors that have been widely accepted, such as treating others with dignity, avoiding harm, and acting in ways that reflect justice and care. That matters because media work often exists in gray areas. There may not always be one easy answer. A story might be legal to publish but still ethically questionable. A piece of content might attract attention but still cause harm. The textbook even points out that something can be legal without being ethical, moral, or virtuous, which is such an important distinction for leadership. That means if I work in media in the future, I cannot use legality as one of the only standards. I need stronger ethical fitness for that. And chapter 5 directly asks whether we are ethically fit. It compares ethical preparedness to the way athletes or performers train before a big event. The point is that ethical action does not happen by accident. It requires awareness and practice. I think that is one of the most valuable ideas in the course. Ethics is not just about knowing what is right, it is about preparing yourself to actually act on it when pressure shows up. One of the most practical ideas in chapter 5 is the idea of the decision action gap. The textbook explains that people often know the right thing to do, but still struggle to act on it. That gap between knowing and doing can be especially large in ethical situations. This matters so much in digital media and journalism. For example, a journalist might know that a source needs more verification before publication, but feel pressure to publish it. A content creator might know that a title is misleading, but feel pressure to increase clicks and engagement. A team member might know that a story framing is unfair, but stay silent because they do not want to conflict with others. Those are not just professional issues, they are leadership issues. The textbook says that leaders make decisions. Even the decisions to not make a decision is a decision. That line is important because silence can also be an ethical choice. If you stay quiet while something harmful is being produced or shared, that is still a decision. The chapter also offers questions that can help guide ethical decision making, such as how will my decision impact others? What is at stake if I act or do not act? Who will be negatively impacted? What are the unintended consequences? And how do others perceive the problem? Those are exactly the kind of questions I think future media professionals need to ask. If I am making content in the future, these textbook questions can help me pause and think more carefully. They can shape my choices about representation, timing, language, source use, and public responsibility. So, when I think about my future occupation, values and ethical action will affect how I verify information, how I frame stories, how I handle pressure, and how I decide what kind of media professional I want to become. This concept is not only about avoiding wrongdoing, it is about building a professional identity that people can trust. So, before moving on, I want to make one final point about why this concept comes first. The textbook makes it clear that ethical values and actions strongly affect a leader's credibility. If a leader fails to attend to values, ethical awareness, and ethical action, that failure can become a moral failure in itself. That is why I see values and ethical action as a foundation, because without it, the other concepts start to break down. You cannot have strong communication if it is dishonest. You cannot have meaningful credibility if your values and actions do not align. You cannot use influence responsibly if your ethics are weak. So, in the future field, ethics is not an extra layer on top of media work, it is the base underneath it. And once we understand that foundation, the next concept naturally becomes communication and listening. Because values may guide what you believe, but communication is how those beliefs are carried into relationships. The second concept I chose is communication and listening. This concept stood out to me because leadership is relational. No matter how strong your values are, leadership still depends on how you connect with other people. And in digital media and journalism, communication is not just important, it is central. You are constantly communicating with others. You communicate with classmates, with team members, with sources, editors, audiences, and the public. But OL202 helped me see that communication is not only about what you say, it is also about how well you understand other people. That is where listening becomes so important. One of the strongest textbook connections here comes from chapter 3, where leadership relationships are discussed using design thinking and user centeredness. The chapter explains that leaders need to understand followers deeply and not just operate from their own assumptions. It emphasizes empathy, user centeredness, and the importance of really understanding what others feel, need, and experience. I think this is very useful way to think about communication. Good communication is not just output. It is not just sending a message. It includes attention, interpretation, listening, and relationship. The textbook even says you can't hate someone whose story you know, and then adds that listening creates a relationship. That line stayed with me because in media and journalism, listening is not just a technique, it is part of ethical and relational leadership. It shapes how well you understand people and how responsibly you represent them. One of the concepts from the textbook that help deepen communication and listening is user centeredness. In chapter 1, design thinking is defined as a mindset that is user centered, explorative, divergent, multidisciplinary, iterative, and iterative. A user centered mindset focuses on the user and how they experience and feel. That idea matters to me a lot because media is also user centered in a way. Even if the word user is more often used in design, journalism and media professionals are still creating for audiences, communities, and people with experiences of their own. So, if I only focus on what I want to say and not on how others will receive, interpret, and feel about what I communicate, then my communication stays one sided. Chapter 3 goes even further by connecting user centeredness to empathy. It explains that empathy is emotionally putting yourself in someone else's position in order to understand their feelings, needs, concerns, and emotional state. It also says that empathy builds trust, provides support, opens communications, and fosters a positive culture. This is a big lesson for leadership. Listening is not passive. It is a part of understanding, it is a part of trust building, it is a part of making people feel recognized. In media work, that matters a lot. That matters in interviews, in collaboration, and in audience engagement. If you're interviewing someone and only waiting for your turn to speak, you are not really listening. If you're receiving audience feedback and instantly dismissing it, you're not really listening. If you're working in a team and ignoring how others are experiencing the process, you are not practicing real leadership. So, for me, communication and listening in the future career will mean more than delivering polished messages. It will mean learning how to ask better questions, how to listen to people's experiences, and how to communicate in ways that show understanding rather than just control. I also want to connect this idea to something else the textbook says in chapter 3. It asks us to consider the differences between a teacher and a textbook, or between a leader and an employee handbook. The answer is the distinctly human part of leadership. I think that is such an important insight. Communication is not just the transfer of information. If it were, then a handbook or a website could replace every leader. But leadership is human because communication is human. It carries tone, it carries care, it carries empathy, and it carries trust. The chapter explains that some of the best leaderships are built on the feeling that the other person really understands you and you can relate to it. It also suggests practices like observing, interviewing, and spending time in the life of the user or the follower to better understand their context. That kind of thinking is directly useful in digital media and journalism. A media professional should not only ask, how do I tell this story? They should also ask, whose experiences am I trying to understand? What context am I missing? What voices have I not really listened to? That is the difference between communication that simply distributes content and communication that actually builds understanding. So, as I move towards a future in this field, this concept will shape the way I conduct interviews, the way I work in collaborative settings, and the way I think about audience response. It will also affect how I lead, because strong leaders do not just speak clearly, they listen deeply enough to make their communication meaningful. I also think that this concept is especially important for first year students because university is full of situations where communication can either strengthen relationships or create misunderstandings. In group projects, people often think communication means dividing tasks and sending messages. But real leadership communication is bigger than that. It means noticing when someone is confused. It means checking whether expectations are actually shared. It means creating spaces for quieter people to speak. It means not assuming that silence equals agreement. Even though these examples seem small, they are where leadership is practiced. And if students begin seeing communication and listening this way early on, they can build stronger habits for later professional environments. In my own future occupation, communication and listening will shape how I represent others, how I work with team members, and how I respond to public feedback. If values and ethical actions are the internal foundations, then communication and listening are one of the first external ways leadership becomes visible. And that brings me to the third concept, which is closely tied to both ethics and communication. That concept is credibility and persuasion. The third concept I chose is credibility and persuasion. I grouped these together because in leadership, and especially in media, persuasion is deeply connected to trust. People are much more likely to be influenced by someone or something they see as credible. This idea is strongly supported in the textbook. In chapter 2, credibility is treated as central to leadership. The chapter asks, why should anyone be led by you? And explains that credibility is what makes others willing to trust and follow a leader. That question is powerful. Why should anyone be led by you? In media, we can adapt that question slightly. Why should anyone trust your reporting? Why should anyone believe your message? Why should anyone be persuaded by what you communicate? The textbook explains that a large part of credibility comes from the perception that a leader cares. It also says credibility depends on building a trust relationship in which followers believe you can and will help facilitate success. That immediately tells us that credibility is not only about expertise, it is also about care, it is also about consistency, honesty, accountability, and the quality of your relationships. That matters a lot in journalism and digital media because a source may be technically informed, but if people do not trust them, their message loses power. A platform may produce a lot of content, but if the audience do not see it as honest or responsible, credibility weakens. So, this concept is important because it helps explain why influence is not automatic. Influence rests on trust. The textbooks gives a really practical breakdown of how credibility is built. It says leaders build credibility through how they treat people, how they treat the job, and how they treat themselves. That includes treating people with respect, honesty, and accountability. Trusting others' capabilities, staying loyal to followers, seeking to inspire, being authentic, continuing to learn and grow, leading by example, and being honest about what you still need to learn. I like this because it shows that credibility is not based on one dramatic moment. It is built through repeated behavior. The textbook even says that people pay attention to small wins and little things, especially in moments of ambiguity, because those moments help them decide whether they are credible. That is extremely relevant to digital media and journalism. Credibility in media can be built through accuracy, consistency, transparency, fair representation, and honest correction of mistakes. It can also be lost quickly, though, and the textbook is very direct about that. It says that not doing something you said you would do, withholding information, or failing to be transparent can crush credibility because people then feel they do not matter and cannot trust you. That is a major lesson for my future career. Because in media, credibility is fragile. If an audience starts to believe that a person or platform is careless, misleading, or hiding important information, trust starts to break. And once trust breaks, persuasion becomes much harder. So, this concept will shape my future choices by pushing me to focus on consistency, honesty, accuracy, and transparency, especially when it would be easier to choose speed or convenience instead. Now, I want to move into persuasion. Persuasion often gets talked about as if it is only about convincing people. But OL202 helped me see that persuasion in leadership is more relational and more ethical than that. The textbook highlights credibility, empathy, and relationship as core parts of effective leadership. It also points to approaches like coaching, support, and understanding what matters to others rather than simply giving orders. That is important because persuasion that works through fear, pressure, or hidden motives is not the same as ethical influence. In media, persuasion happens all the time. It happens through framing, it happens through visual choices, it happens through structure, language, tone, and emphasis. A story may not openly say believe this, but it still guides the audience towards particular interpretations. So, persuasion is not always direct. Sometimes it is embedded in the design of communication itself. That is why credibility matters so much. If I want to influence people responsibly in the future, I cannot treat persuasion as manipulation. I need to understand that ethical persuasion depends on trust, care, honesty, and clarity. The textbook's credibility model helps here because it reminds us that people are not only asking whether you are knowledgeable, they are also asking whether you care, whether you are authentic, and whether they can believe you. In digital media and journalism, credibility affects almost every part of professional practice. It affects whether audiences trust a report, whether they return to a platform, whether they believe a correction, whether they see a journalist as fair, whether they regard content as thoughtful or sensational. It also affects professional relationships. Editors, collaborators, and sources are more likely to work well with someone who is consistent and trustworthy. So, if I think about the future choices I will make, this concept will matter in a few very practical ways. It will shape how I carefully verify information. It will shape whether I admit when I need to learn more. It will shape whether I build my work around long term trust instead of short term attention. It will shape how I speak to people and about people. And it will shape the kind of reputation I develop over time. To me, this is one of the biggest lessons here. Credibility is not an image you create once, it is a pattern you build. And persuasion is strongest when it grows out of that pattern. Now, once we understand that leadership depends on ethics, communication, and trust, the next challenge that becomes is how do leaders respond when situations are changing, problems are messy, and old solutions are not enough? This is where creativity and idea generation becomes so important. The fourth concept I chose is creativity and idea generation. This concept stood out to me because leadership is not always about maintaining what already exists. It is also about responding to challenges, imagining better possibilities, and solving problems in new ways. Chapter 8 of the textbook explains that creativity is one of the most valuable yet misunderstood attributes in both personal and organizational success. It also connects creativity to innovation and problem solving and makes the point that leaders often say they value creativity, but they do not always know how to purposefully develop it. I think this is especially important in digital media and journalism because this field changes constantly. Platforms change, audience habits change, technologies change, formats change. What gets attention changes, what counts as effective storytelling changes. So, if someone enters this field with a rigid mindset, it becomes very difficult to adapt. OL 202 helped me understand creativity not as something magical, but as something that can be developed through habits of thinking. That makes creativity feel more practical. It is not just about artistic talent, it is about seeing differently, asking better questions, generating possibilities, and working through challenges with flexibility and openness. One of the strongest textbook links here comes from Chapter 1 and the Design Thinking Framework. Chapter 1 defines design thinking as a cognitive approach to engaging problems through a mindset that is user centered, explorative, divergent, multidisciplinary, iterative, iterative. That framework is incredibly useful for creativity. Instead of waiting for one perfect idea to appear, it encourages leaders to understand the problem, imagine possibilities, implement ideas, and keep iterating. The chapter presents the design process as understand, imagine, implement, and iterate. That matters because creativity is often strongest when people resist the urge to jump straight to one solution. Chapter 8 continues this by discussing divergent thinking. It explains that divergent thinking is the mindset of generating many ideas from a single problem. It also connects creativity to fluency, originality, flexibility, and elaboration, showing that creativity and creative thinking can be assessed and developed rather than treated as mystery. I really like that because it turns creativity into something you can practice. In media and journalism, this can apply for storytelling formats, research strategies, visual communication, campaign designs, interviewing approaches, and problem solving with fast changing environments. For example, if one storytelling method is not reaching audiences effectively, a creative mindset might help you generate alternatives. Maybe the issue needs a video instead of an article. Maybe it needs a podcast. Maybe it needs an interactive visual. Maybe it needs a different framing entirely. So, in my future occupation, creativity and idea generation will shape how I respond when challenges do not have obvious answers. Chapter 8 also helped me rethink brainstorming. A lot of people treat brainstorming casually, like just saying random ideas out loud. But the textbook explains that brainstorming is actually a specific technique with rules. Those rules include going for quality, withholding criticism and judgment, encouraging wild ideas, and combining and improving ideas by building off each other's ideas. This is a really useful leadership lesson. Sometimes people assume creativity means no structure, but the textbook shows that structure can actually support creativity. Rules can create the kind of environment where more ideas are possible. I think that is especially relevant in collaborative media environments. If I am working with a team on content, campaigns, or storytelling projects in the future, creativity will not only come from individual talent, it will also come from how the group is led. If people feel judged too quickly, they stop contributing. If teams settle for the first workable idea, they may miss much better ones. If leaders do not create room for experimentation, innovation gets weaker. The textbook also says that at the heart of idea generating techniques is to push to see differently. It encourages people to zoom in, zoom out, reverse perspectives, and view problems through someone else's eyes. That line feels especially important for journalism because strong journalism often depends on seeing differently, seeing beyond assumptions, seeing what others overlook, seeing context, contradiction, and possibility. So, this concept will shape my future choices by making me more willing to test ideas, seeking different perspectives, and resist settling too quickly for one predictable answer. The fifth and final concept I chose is influence and power. This concept feels like a natural ending point because leadership itself is defined in the textbook as the process of influencing others towards a common vision. So, in a way, all five concepts lead here. Values affect the kind of influence you use. Communication affects how influence is experienced. Credibility affects whether influence works. Creativity affects what possibilities you offer. And power affects how influence is carried out. Chapter 7 is especially important here. It explains that influence, power, and motivation are central realities of leadership, and that they must be applied carefully in just equitable, sustainable, and ethical ways. The last part matters a lot to me because influence and power are not automatically positive. They can help people, but they can also silence, pressure, mislead, or mismanipulate. This is especially true in digital media and journalism. Media has power. Stories shape public understanding, visual framing influences interpretation, repeated messages affect what seems normal, urgent, believable, or important. So, if I work in this field, I need to understand that influence is part of the job, whether I acknowledge it or not. And because it is a part of the job, I need to learn how to use that influence responsibly. One of the most useful parts of Chapter 7 is that it distinguishes between influence, authority, and manipulation. The chapter explains that authority is formal power that comes from a role or position, while influence is more often rooted in informal power, such as charisma, expertise, experience, wisdom, or relationships. This is really important distinction. Not everyone in media has formal authority, but many people still have influence. A journalist may not hold political power, but their work can shape public discourse. A content creator may not hold formal authority over an audience, but they may still influence what people believe or pay attention to. The chapter also clearly distinguishes influence from manipulation. It says manipulation is similar to influence, but usually involves hidden or unauthentic intent and some level of deceit. Ethical leaders, by contrast, should be transparent and upfront about their motives as they try to move individuals or group towards a desired mindset or action. This is one of the strongest points in this chapter. In media, the line between influence and manipulation can become blurry if values are weak. Clickbaits, misleading framing, strategic omission, emotional exploitation, and hidden agendas can all push communication towards manipulation. So, in my future occupation, this concept will matter because I want to be aware of that line. I want to understand that influencing people is unavoidable in media, but manipulating them is not acceptable. That means being honest about purpose, being transparent about information, and making sure that influence does not come at the cost of integrity. Chapter 7 also helps us think more carefully about what power comes from. The chapter notes that leadership is more often about informal power than formal power, and that informal power can come from characteristics such as charisma, expertise, experiences, or relationship. This is very relevant to media and journalism. In this field, expertise matter, credibility matters, relationship matters. The ability to communicate clearly matters. These things can all become sources of power. The chapter also reminds leaders that biases influence how they see others and how they judge the world. It explains that explicit and implicit biases can corrode trust, credibility, and relationships if left unchecked. That is especially important in media. Because if a media professional does not examine their own biases, those biases can shape what stories gets attention, how people are represented, and how audiences are influenced. So, influence and power are not only external, they also require self-awareness. If I want to use influence responsibly in the future, I need to ask, what is influencing me? What assumptions am I carrying? What patterns am I reinforcing? And how might my own perspective distort what I communicate? This is one reason OL 202 is so useful. It does not let leadership stay superficial. It keeps bringing things back to self awareness, design, relationships, and ethics. Now that I have gone through all five concepts, I want to briefly show how they connect. Values and ethical action are the foundation because they shape what I stand for. Communication and listening make leadership relational and help me understand others. Credibility and persuasion explain why people trust certain voices and messages. Creativity and idea generation help leaders respond to change and think beyond obvious solutions. And influence and power show how leadership actually affects people, teams, and public conversation. To me, these concepts are not separate, they work together. If values are weak, influence becomes risky. If communication is weak, trust suffers. If creativity is weak, leadership becomes limited. That is why I chose these five concepts. Together, they explain leadership in a fuller and more realistic way, especially in a field like digital media and journalism. The assignment also asks how these concepts will inform my future occupation, so I want to answer that directly. As someone interested in digital media and journalism, these concepts will shape the kind of professional I want to become. Values and ethical action will guide how I verify information and how responsibly I frame stories. Communication and listening will shape how I work with people and understand the audiences I'm speaking to. Credibility and persuasion will remind me to build trust instead of only chasing attention. Creativity and idea generation will help me adapt, problem solving, and stay open to new approaches. And influence and power will shape how I use my voice responsibly and think carefully about the impact of my work. Together, these concepts will guide both my decisions and my professional identity. Before I close, I want to return to the audience for this lecture, which is first year students. If you are just starting university, leadership can feel like something far away. But OL202 shows that leadership already begins in your daily choices, your relationships, and the way you respond to challenges. You do not need a title to start developing as a leader. You are already shaping that process through how you treat people, how you communicate, and what you choose to stand for. This is why this course matters as much early on. It reminds us that leadership is something we practice, not something we wait for. To conclude, the five most important concepts from OL202 for me are values and ethical action, communication and listening, credibility and persuasion, creativity and idea generation, and influence and power. I chose these concepts because they connect strongly to digital media and journalism and because they change the way I think about leadership. This course showed me that leadership is not just about authority, it is about values, relationships, trust, adaptability, and responsibility. As I move towards my future career, these concepts will continue to shape how I communicate and how I make decisions and how I want the others to experience my work. So, I want to end with one final question. What kind of leader are you already becoming through the choices you make now? Thank you.